we are now looking at 3B.1, and we'll be solving by taking square roots. And our master learning objective is I can solve quadratic equations involving imaginary numbers by taking square roots. Okay? So we have our quadratic equation, right? Ax squared plus bx plus c. It's second degree, meaning we have two solutions always. Okay? And think about, right, if we have complex solutions, right, that have an I in them, those imaginary, how many I's do you have? You have two I's. Okay? So you'll always have that number of imaginary solutions. So let's look at our steps. Make sure what is being squared is by itself. In this case, x is being squared. It is currently not by itself, so I'm going to subtract 4. Okay, check. Take the square root of both sides. Okay. Check. Simplify. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of negative 4, well, that's the square root of 4 times the square root of negative 1. So x equals, don't forget plus or minus, so plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of negative 1 is I. How many answers? Oh wait, solve for the variable. This one is already solved for us. There should be a green check there. Okay, right, there's nothing else I have to do to solve for x. So there are two answers. X equals 2i and x equals negative 2i, okay? All right, let's look at our next question. X squared minus 4 equals 0. Same thing, here's what's being squared. So I'm going to add 4. So now x squared equals positive 4. So now when I take the square root, the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 4, well, plus or minus 2. So x equals 2, x equals negative 2. There is no I because there's no negative number. Okay? So be careful with whether it has an I or not. Looking at number 3, here's what's being squared. Draw that line down my equal sign. Add 6. X squared equals 6. Take the square root of both sides. Simplify, the square root of x squared is x. Square root of 6, I cannot take the square root of 6, but I still need the plus or minus. There is no I because there's no negative number. So x equals plus or minus square root 6. Those are my two answers. X equals positive square root 6. X equals negative square root 6. Number 4, x squared plus 10 equals 0. Here's what's being squared. Subtract 10 from both sides. Take the square root of x squared, the square root of, sorry, it's negative 10. The negative kind of got lost in there. The square root of x squared is x equals square root of negative 10 is the square root of 10 times the square root of negative 1. I cannot take the square root of 10, although it still needs a plus or minus, and the square root of negative 1 is I. Okay. So x equals square root 10i. Be very careful that I is not under the square root, right? It's outside of the square root. All right, number 5, 6x squared. So subtract 12. we have 6x squared. Well, again, same thing. This x squared is really what's being squared here, so then I have to divide by 6. So we get x squared equals -2. Now I can take the square root. X equals the square root of 2 times the square root of -1 minus square root 2i. So x equals square root 2i, and x equals negative square root 2i. Alright, go ahead, turn the page. Looking at number 6, same type of thing. X squared. So I'm going to add 27. I have 3x squared equals 27. Still trying to get that x squared by itself. So I'm going to divide by 3. Now that x squared is by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. Plus or minus. Right, there is no I here, right, because there is no negative, so it's just plus or minus square root 3. So x equals 3 and x equals -3. Looking at number 7, x minus 6 squared, this is what's being squared. I'm going to subtract 1. So I get x minus 6 squared equals -5. From here, I take my square root, right? Because all of that is in parentheses being squared. The squared and the square root cancel out, so I'm left with x minus 6 equals the square root of 5 times the square root of -1. So x minus 6 equals plus or minus square root 5, square root of -1 is I. So I'm going to write my two answers. Sorry, I wrote the plus and minus sign again. Equals positive 5i and equals -5i, square root 5i. Now, x is not by itself yet, so I'm going to add 6 to both sides on both equations. What your real part, the part without the I, goes first. So that's positive 6 plus the square root of 5i. This one is x equals positive 6 minus the square root of 5i. Those are my two answers. All right, looking at number 8, same type of thing. I'm going to add 3 first. We want to get this by itself, right? So we have x plus 2 squared. These cancel out. 6 plus 3 is 9. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. That squared and that square root cancel out. So I'm left with x plus 2 equals, the square root of 9 is positive or -3. So that's x plus 2 equals 3, and x plus 2 equals -3. And then from here I'm solving for x. So I'm going to subtract 2, and I'm going to subtract 2. Again, here there's no I, so I can't actually combine those because it's positive. All right, looking at number 9, we have x minus 5 squared minus 2. This is what I'm trying to get by itself, so I'm going to add 2. So that's x minus 5 squared. Those cancel. Negative 102 plus 2 is negative 100. Then, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. This squared and this square root cancel out, so I'm left with x minus 5 equals, and the square root of 100 is the same as the square root of negative 100 is the same as square root of 100 times the square root of negative 1. So then I have x minus 5 equals, the square root of 100 is plus or minus 10. The square root of negative 1 is I. Split them up. X minus 5 equals 10I. And x minus 5 equals negative 10I. And finally, get our final answer. Solve for x. I'm going to add 5. This goes first. So we have positive 5, positive 10i, so 5 plus 10i. Same thing here, add 5. I have positive 5 and minus 10i. So 5 plus 10i and 5 minus 10i. All right, last two examples, very similar. We have 2 times x minus 5 squared plus 3 equals 17. This is what's being squared. So I have to get rid of the 3 and the 2. I'm going to subtract 3. (17 minus 3 is 14. And then I'm going to divide by 2. (14 divided by 2 is 7. Now that I have what's being squared by itself, I'm going to take the square root. I cannot take the square root of 7, so that's just plus or minus square root 7. Then split it up. X minus 5 equals square root 7, and x minus 5 equals negative square root 7. Solving for x, I'm going to add 5. So that's x equals that positive 5, and there's a positive square root 7, so plus. Add 5. There's a positive 5 and a minus square root 7. So 5 plus square root 7, 5 minus square root 7. All right, last problem. Same thing, this x plus 4 squared is what's being squared. So I'm going to add 5. So that's 3 times x plus 4 squared equals negative 48, I believe. That is x plus 4 squared equals negative 16. Now I can take the square root and the square root of negative 16 is the same thing as the square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. The square root of 16 is positive and negative 4. The square root of negative 1 is I. Splitting it up, I have x plus 4 equals positive 4i, and x plus 4 equals negative 4i. Solving for x, I'm subtracting 4 from both sides. That's negative 4 plus 4i. I cannot cross out these 4s. One's a 4i and one's just a 4. They're not the same type of thing. Same thing here, subtract 4. So that's that negative 4 minus 4i. Right. So that was a bit of a longer video, but lots of different types of examples for you to look at. Otherwise, go ahead and get started working on your activity.